Lecture 7. The next two lectures are about the aesthetic imagination. One lecture is about the cognitive side, the other lecture is about the emotional side. We begin with a very simple question. What is the difference between everyday and aesthetic reception or aesthetic processing? First, let me tell you about everyday processing that we're used to. Now, the goal of everyday perception is to identify useful objects and situations that help us adapt and survive. It's a very straightforward task. This is an automatic process. But what's interesting is en route to identifying these objects in the situation, we discard the sensations, we discard individual features that may be distracting. We don't notice them. We just notice who, what, and where. We're conscious of the world, but not of the intervening sensations or psychological processes that lead to our interpretation of it. Now, this everyday pragmatic processing is automatic and has evidently a bit of a cognitive bias because you're concerned with things and objects and people and utility. You're not looking at the colors or the feelings of it. Aesthetic processing is very different. In the 18th century, the philosopher Baumgarten defined aesthetics as the science of sensuous knowledge, the orderly processing of sensuous knowledge. And in the early 20th century, Shklovsky argued that, quote, the purpose of art is to impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known. The technique of art is to make things unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and the length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic end in itself and must be prolonged. In other words, art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. The object itself is not important. In other words, the purpose of aesthetic reception is to de-automatize, to render less automatic the cognitive bias of everyday life and reinvest attention in patterns of sensation. In other words, we want to slow down the perceptual cognitive process and feel it as it unfolds. A good image here for us is to think of standing by the side of a lake at sunset, and everything slows down, and you can notice the colors changing. This is what he means by investing attention in sensory process. So what's unique about aesthetic experience? It combines two things. It combines subject matter or narrative, the subject matter of everyday life, can be transposed to the subject matter of an artwork or film, but it adds to it these special sensory qualities, these physical qualities that when they're organized in a painting, we call the visual style of the painting. So that's what's unique about aesthetics. In art, it's a unique combination of subject matter and style that we experience as a unified whole. Now, people don't automatically do this. It's one thing to observe sunset and how beautiful it is, and quite another thing to go into a museum or a gallery and look at an artwork and appreciate it. So philosophers have talked about cultivating an aesthetic attitude, which means a shift from the pragmatics of everyday life to a way of seeing the unification of subject matter and style. They call it unity amidst diversity. Unity amidst diversity. And this is mediated by the brain, as we've shown in collaboration with my colleagues. There's an area of the brain, Brodmann area 10, that mediates this shift from pragmatic to aesthetic reception. We do it intentionally. We are aware of the shift. We are aware of the setting or situation that we're in. We're going into a museum. I'm changing the way I'm looking at things. We're going into a movie. I'm changing the way I'm looking at things. I will adjust to the style, the shift in the film between close-ups and panning away, between faster or slow motion. We know that these are techniques that we will encounter. Now, of course, everyday and aesthetic perception can interpenetrate. They're not unrelated. Buying an artwork can be influenced by cost. It's one thing to love an artwork and quite another thing to buy it. In the same way, you can say, look, you can place an artwork in a room so that it creates a certain atmosphere. Just don't say that to the artist. I'm buying the painting because it's got a lot of blue. They don't consider it a compliment. And this is just like deciding whether your clothes match a particular occasion. Now, I want to shift to a discussion of a theme that's been consistent through my lectures, the complementary relationship between top-down logical and bottom-up expressive processes. Let me begin with top-down logical and objective processes. Consider what the effects are of subject matter that frame an artwork. They give meaning to the artwork. They orient us. And the question is, how deeply do viewers go into the narrative? Because the same person can stand in front of one artwork and another person next to them, and they see it differently. They penetrate to different levels of depth. Less experienced viewers will focus on likeness. Oh, that looks like a dog, that looks like a bird. Look how well my child paints or draws. The criterion there is mimesis, likeness. And the same thing in reading stories. People can read stories and notice familiar elements that are relevant to them or their culture. More experienced viewers, more experienced readers focus on subtleties of subject matter. We use the term iconography to refer to those elements in artworks that have a literary implication or a cultural implication that goes beyond the work, that grounds the work in the broader culture. Also, a person can go deeper into the work because of their training to see them as exemplars of particular styles associated with schools or eras or even individual artists. So cultivating taste, cultivating knowledge is a matter of practice, but then it becomes automatic. So we can have the naive view of art, the less experienced view of art, where we're looking at the surface and just identifying there's a man and a woman and a canoe, or a deeper view of art where you understand what the story is actually alluding to. Now there's a limitation to top-down activity. There's a limitation to objective processing. It can short-circuit experience because you can rush to identify the subject matter of the work, or you can rush to identify the style of the work. And once you've identified, you turn the process off, you terminate the process. So excessive logical processing can cut down our ability to get into a deeper understanding of the subject matter of work or to experience the style of the work. Now I shift to bottom-up processes. Imagination shapes our emerging experience of the artwork. In the 1920s, Sander had the notion of actual genese, percept emergent. It emerges over time. And one can say further that we can speak that the representation emerges. It unfolds. So, the experience of subject matter is set against the background of style, which are organized sensations. The work emerges from the style. The image emerges from the style. And in fact, the fundamental dimension that underlies our emerging perception is hard edge versus soft edge. When something has a clear boundary, it's easier to discern what it is, to identify it in a top-down way. But when there are soft edges, like in Impressionist paintings, or soft edge photographs, or soft edge photography and film, we begin to participate more. And the area of the brain that's associated with this is Brodmann Area 7. Generally speaking, I'm making the point that when we look at art, when we read novels or look at plays, suggestion meets connection as a fundamental principle. Personal meanings or cultural meanings are awakened as we interpret the work. We make connections to the work. This process may be unconscious. We may not be aware of it. We may not be aware that a particular play or film is making us have a reaction. We don't really know why. It's not necessarily a conscious process. The point is, in the depth of processing approach to understanding art, the more we see in the work and relate to our own lives empathically, the greater our attachment to the work. We build a bridge to the work. The separation is diminished. I want to just review some basic schools in psychology which have contributed to our understanding of this depth of processing model. Information theory, that was particularly popular in the 1950s and 1960s, adopted a kind of cognitive motivational approach. They talked about layers of information. At the bottom, we have a concrete layer that's stylistic, as I've explained already. Organized sensations. They have a certain expressive quality. They create a certain atmosphere. They have a certain connotation. The darkness of the painting, the darkness of the photograph gives you a sense for the mood of the narrative, the mood of the subject matter. At the other end, we have the abstract meaning, the symbolic aspect of it, the narrative. It's denotative, it's logical, it's utilitarian. So we move upwards from this fundamental, concrete experience of sensation to the ultimate meanings. Now, there's a very interesting trade-off here in an information theory sense that I've taken from Wendell Garner, psychologist who was from Yale in the early 60s. And it has to do with the trade-off between internal and external constraint. To understand external constraint, we imagine an air traffic control radar screen that has points in it that refer to isomorphically to aircrafts in space. And each point gives you a sense for where the planes are, and that's how you're tracking the work. In the context of art, external constraint means as we apply the paint to the surface, the elements in it refer to particular things in a realistic context out there in the scene that we're depicting. So we have high external constraint in cases of high realism. The features in the artworks refer in an isomorphic way to elements out there in the world. When seen together, these affordances enable us to read the scene clearly. Internal constraint refers to something opposite. In internal constraint, the dots on the radar screen or the dots of color in the painting have a certain kind of unique relationship that need not bear isomorphically to something outside. They have some kind of special relations based on color, based on tone, based on texture, variables related to art itself. There's a trade-off here. To the extent that we want the work to refer to something out there in the world, then it must be externally constrained. There's no room for playfulness. To the extent that we have the introduction of a new stylistic variation based on color changes, based on texture changes, perhaps even compositional changes, the structure of relations among elements in the work becomes somewhat unique and harder to read. So therefore, there's a trade-off as we have stylistic innovations or expressive innovations in art. The more the artist introduces a unique code of relating things on the surface of the work in two dimensions, the more the artist is expressive in choosing and interacting among these elements in the two-dimensional surface of the work, it interferes with seeing something three-dimensionally. That's the trade-off. The more internal constraint, the more expressive, the more unique, the harder to read. This can be applied as well to our decoding of facial expressions. Because if a facial expression is very readable, it's highly constrained. In a sense, we can open a book, open a coding manual, and say, oh, I see, if there are these muscular movements and configurations, it means happiness or sadness or anger or fear. But everyday life doesn't work like that. Everyday life is more internally constrained. Internally constrained in the sense that we have blends of emotions. And a real slice of life and a real slice of facial expressions in time will have these various emotions enmeshed, working together to express how the person feels in the moment. So external constraint in facial expressions means a stereotyped idea of what an emotion should look like. Internal constraint with reference to facial expressions is more ecologically valid. It's more relevant to how people really show emotions in everyday life because they're blends of emotions. So external constraint in paintings or in faces is more stereotyped, more isomorphic, more readable, but to the extent that things are more unique and more original, they're internally constrained, unique patterns. We must learn to read them, both in faces and in paintings. So that's the information theory school. The Gestalt psychologists from the late 1800s, having a very powerful impact into more or less the mid-20th century, talked again about this emergent nature of aesthetic experience. They emphasized the unity of the experience, the holistic nature of it. And it's a bottom-up model that goes from the global feeling of the work to, as we look at it more and more closely, we get into greater and greater detail and articulation. In a sense, these expressive qualities of the work, the effects of the color, the effects of the shape of the brushwork, are spontaneously experienced as forces for these Gestalt psychologists. In a sense, the body feels the painting before it knows the painting, from a Gestalt viewpoint. And so they're dealing with what we call figure-ground relations. The subject matter emerges from the background. And because of this relationship between the two, it resonates with the qualities of the background. And the qualities of the background lend a metaphorical aspect to our experience of the work. So for the Gestaltists, subject matter and form work together. One emerges from the other in a bottom-up way. The expressive quality of the subject matter spontaneously and immediately shapes our experience of the work itself. Now, in the psychodynamic approach, it's quite different. The aesthetic experience has a certain projective aspect to it. We constitute the meaning. The elements of the image can be symbolically rich for us. We interpret the work. We project our lives into the work. So the work of art is not merely a work of art on the wall. There's a relationship that we have to it. Some works are more meaningful to us than others because they address themes that are personally meaningful in a way that permits us to be expressive. So from a psychodynamic viewpoint, looking at the artwork can be cathartic because we can have this buildup of energy that's released when we see a film that permits us to open the door that's been closed to the expression of emotion. It's part of our relationship to the work of art. And this is what's crucial to the psychological approach to aesthetics. We're not talking about the art in and of itself. We're talking about the relationship of the person to it. And the psychodynamic approach is particularly sensitive to the effect of powerful energy that symbolically attracts us and develops a relationship for us. From the viewpoint of the artist in a psychodynamic approach, inspiration is followed by elaboration. So the first step is this spontaneous response to the theme or whatever, whether we're the artist or whether we're the viewer. But as we spend more and more time, we become clearer about it and it becomes more articulated. In a sense, the artist engages in what they call regression in service of the ego, a reaching back to a, quote, more primitive or childlike viewing of a scene, depicting of an image that permits greater freedom and flexibility. So we go away from the constraints of everyday life and we permit a more playful procedure for creating our art. And in a symmetrical way, the viewer who can relate to the work similarly goes back. It's like looking at Monty Python humorous sketches. They're completely silly. And if we're very, very literal about it, we say, well, that's silly. I can't even look at it. But if you just go with it and become playful yourself, you begin to build a bridge. So the psychodynamic approach is very sensitive to the syncretic nature of these images. They have sights and sounds and tastes and feels and meanings that are all together in a unified whole that can be meaningful to some and not to others. But to appreciate them, we need to become more playful and move away from the practical views of everyday life. Now here's an interesting trade-off on emotional leakage, which is just like nonverbal leakage. In a nonverbal leakage case, you go into an interview for a job, you're going to be very, very serious, but you're playing with the desk or your knees are wobbling. And you don't notice it, but the interviewer notices it. We have an interesting case of nonverbal leakage in art having to do with this beautiful trade-off between subject matter and style, which as follows. It goes both ways. We can focus on the subject matter. I'm going to make this sculpture, this painting, look just like the model. But you've had a tough day, or you have stress in your life, and you don't realize that you're squeezing the clay harder, or you don't realize that you're moving more quickly with the brush, or choosing brighter colors than you normally would. So there's a leakage. You just think you're doing the model. The next day, you take a look at your work and you go, how could I have done this? There's all this hidden expression I didn't know about. And you get the other version of this. The artist can be very focused on his or her technique. I'm trying out a particular procedure. I'm working with certain colors and textures and methods. But they don't realize that the subject matter that they've picked accidentally is revealing a lot about their own lives. So that's a very interesting leakage. You think you're controlling the subject matter, sneaks in through the style. You think you're just working with the style, sneaks in through the subject matter, and you don't notice it, which raises a very interesting issue. As we move up toward the great artists, the great geniuses of art, were they free of this matter or not? Finally, we have the phenomenological and existential approaches to art. The phenomenological approach to art, as I emphasized in my analysis of emotion, talks about the plasticity of experience. Best exemplified when we think about films. We go into a movie and the artist, in this case, the montage person, the person creating the work, slows it down or speeds it up or chooses an open space or a bright light or a dark light. And all these choices become the form of our experience. The plasticity of time, speeding up, slowing down, of space, opening up or closing in, of causality, breaking down so things come out of nowhere unexpectedly, of materiality and awareness of sensation and light or texture, and connection with others, pulling us in or moving us away. On the existential side, modern art reflects a kind of revolt against the traditional views of art as very precise or very constrained. It's important to remember that Impressionist painting was rejected in the 1860s in Paris as just weak sketching. And now they pay so much money for it. People didn't have that way of decoding the work, experiencing it and seeing past it, slowing down. They were concerned with historical themes. So in the end, I come to a kind of balancing between the thinking I, EYE, that's the top-down, organized, structured part of the work, and the being I, the spontaneous unconscious, the spontaneous meanings. Thinking I, EYE, and being I, capital I. Thinking I addresses the formal aspects of perception, adaptation. We carry it over from everyday life strategically into the art domain, and the being I that encourages us to confront meanings and metaphors that echo with our own personal histories. So when we look at it from the being I viewpoint, being turns into becoming. So in the end, we have a balance of being outside and inside, of the thinking I that organizes technique and the being I that playfully expresses meanings. And we need to be in both. And as I've argued through all the lectures, we have to be able to shift between the objective detached view and the subjective engaged view. All the different schools of art, all the different schools of literature require a balance between these two approaches, the objective and detached, the subjective and the engaged. Thank you very much.